So our speaker today is Marc Fleurbaey, who is the Kuenne Professor in Economics and Humanistic Studies on the faculties of the Woodrow Wilson School and the Center for Human Values. Before coming to Princeton, he was an economist at INSEE in Paris, professor of economics at the universities of Cergy-Pontoise and Pau in France also, and a research director at CNRS in Paris. He's currently the coordinating editor of the journal Social Choice and Welfare. Marc co-authored Beyond GDP with Didier Blanchet in 2013 and A Theory of Fairness and Social Welfare with François Maniquet in 2011. He is among the few, if any, other economists working in the climate arena who have focused on distributive justice. I'm privileged to be collaborating on a project with Marc in jointly advising Hélène Benveniste on her dissertation research in the STEP program. Marc's topic today is the green liberal dilemma in climate policy. Please join me in welcoming Marc Fleurbaey.
Okay,
over to you, Marc.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, and thank you all for attending this video talk. So I'd like to talk about the green liberal dilemma in climate policy. And I apologize for not showing my face right now because I'm sharing my screen, and it's safer to keep the sharing mode for now. And I'll show you my face after when we are at the Q&A stage. Okay, so the issue of mixing redistribution and environmental issues is very much in the political debates these days, right? The Green New Deal and Sustainable Development Goals, they are all mixing these things, and we could wonder whether this is a sort of hoax. And I'm just putting this word here as a kind of joke because it's a word that is now very popular. So on one side of the political spectrum, you hear that environmental policies will not be viable if they are not taking into account social considerations, and the Yellow Vest movement in my country, France, is a good example of this kind of issue. On the other side of the spectrum, you hear that these Green New Deals that are appearing in many places, not just in the US, but also in Europe and also at the world level, they smuggle in social policies which have nothing to do with the climate or the environment. So we can look very briefly to start this at the fact that there is actually a correlation in people's values and political preferences. Those who have greater social concern also have greater environmental concern. So let me briefly illustrate that. So this comes from the World Values Survey showing data for the US and showing that the proportion of people who believe that protecting the environment should be given priority is declining as you go toward the part of the population who believe that inequalities are not so important. Right? It's not actually a monotonic relation. So here at the beginning, you have the people who care a lot about redistribution. They might care a little less about the environment. But so this is an interesting shape, actually. This comes from the Pew Research Center, and is something that is very well known. So you have the people, the percentage of people who say that this topic should be a top priority for the president and the Congress, and you have the Democrats very high on the environment and climate change, and also very high on poverty and the needs of the population, right? So we do observe this correlation. So what I want to do in this talk is to step back from politics and from ideological values and ask the question, is there a potential tension between reducing inequalities or being concerned about social issues and preserving the environment and the climate in particular? So my talk will be mostly about ethics. That's my specialty. But facts, so I'll talk more about principles than empirical facts, but facts give the context in which we can discuss the application of principles. So there will be a little bit of empirical considerations there. So I'll go over three instances of a potential clash. First, the discounting debate. Second, the question of carbon pricing and burden sharing, and in particular, the question of whether we should have multiple carbon prices or taxes in the world or just one. And finally, I want to say something about the fact that usually in climate discourses, especially among economists, there is a focus on efficiency issues rather than equity issues. And I want to discuss that. So I'll be relying on several papers. Some have been published and the last two are still in progress. So I very much look forward to your reactions. This is my little advertising moment for the Climate Futures Initiative, our group in Princeton, because all of these people here have been involved with this group, either as visitors or as postdocs and so on. Okay, so let me start with the discounting debate. And if there is any problem for some of you, I propose that you use the chat function, given that you cannot unmute yourself, to signal if you have a problem, and then the moderators will help you, or will warn me and tell me to stop if there is any problem. Okay, so let's start with the discounting debate. So this table is what the US administration used to produce some time ago. It looks like ages ago now. And this was the work of the interagency group that was proposing a price for carbon. And they were looking at different possible discount rates. And depending on the discount rate, you had a different value for the carbon price. So the higher the discount rate, the lower the value for the carbon price, and that was recommended. Okay, so so this is setting up the problem of the carbon pricing as something that's closely related and closely dependent on the discount rate that you use. So let me explain that a little bit. So the underlying vision behind this approach is to see the climate mitigation policies as an investment problem. Right, and what I've done here is to take the DICE model that has been put up by William Nordhaus, and I have looked at a rather ambitious scenario where we would decarbonize in 20 years from now, in 2030. And so you have the baseline, which is the green curve here, and that represents the consumption per capita in thousands of dollars. And you have what happens if we decarbonize very strongly. So here it looks viewed from this perspective, which goes toward until the year 2500, right? So it's a long period of evaluation, long horizon. It looks like it's really a great policy to decarbonize quickly because we avoid substantial climate impacts. But at the beginning, you can't really see, but there is a cost that has to be paid for that policy, right? So there is an investment that is made. So let me represent the difference between the two curves now, okay? So if we look at the difference, we get something like that. And so we still have a very substantial benefit. So that's this difference is very high. And you see the difference in the future is in the range of $100,000 per year per capita, which is about 8 times the current average income per capita at the world level. So it's really a big benefit, but there is a cost, and the cost, you can see that the green line goes below the horizontal axis for some time until around 2070. So there is a amount of money. The face value of this money is reduced by 1.5% every time I move to next year, right? Every time I consider that it will occur, this money will arrive 1 year later. And so if you do that, 1.5 next year, and then 1.5 of 1.5 the year after, and so on, that's a lot of a reduction in the future. So much so that after 3 centuries or 2 centuries, actually, you already see that you have reduced things essentially to something that's almost negligible, right? And so it's the same benefit as we had before, but now what happens after 2 or 3 centuries becomes essentially negligible, even though it was so big initially, right? So that's with a very, very low discount rate. 1.5 was not even in the table of the interagency group. So if you take the 3% discount that they were somehow putting in the middle of their table, you get something that looks like that. And there you see that, so this is the green curve on this graph. And this green curve, as what is below the horizontal axis, looks bigger if you aggregate all the cost over all these periods than what you gain in the future, right? So at 3% discount, this policy doesn't look good. at 1.5% discount, it looks good because the cost doesn't look so big compared to the benefit that you have in the future, right? So that's the way discounting proceeds. Okay, now let me get a little bit into the debates about how to select the discount rate, right? Why 3% rather than something else, for instance? And so that goes back to a formula that was almost, not quite in the way it is used now, but almost in a paper from 1927 by Frank Ramsey, which had this formula. So the discount rate will add up two terms that represent two reasons to discount the future. So the first parameter is called the pure time preference parameter. And that's a term that just represents the fact that you discount the future just because it is the future. So that may sound a little weird. Why should we give less weight to the future just because it is in the future? There is nevertheless one reason why the future may have less importance than the present. We are sure we exist in the present. We are not sure the future will exist for us, and especially for the human species or even for living beings on the earth in some time in the future. And so the probability of extinction is something that may justify a little bit of pure time preference. But that seems to be the only good reason to have such a pure time preference. So it should be very small. Now, the second reason to discount is the fact that the future will be richer than us. And here you have the product of two terms in the Ramsey formula. You have the growth rate, the average growth rate between now and the future period you are looking at, and multiplied by a coefficient that represents the priority to give to the worse off. And so these two terms multiply because you will give less importance to the future, the richer the future is, and the more, right? So it's a combination, and the more you care about the poor, and the less you care about the rich, therefore, right? So it's really these two considerations will play together in a multiplicative way. And so what happened in this debate, and the debate I will go back to Stern and Nordhaus in the beginning of the century, where really it was about the choice of the discount rate. And what happened was that Stern advocated an ambitious climate policy, an aggressive climate policy, and Nordhaus wanted a more lenient policy. And somehow you see the choice of their parameters for the discount rate reflected that and triggered these conclusions quite directly. So Stern used a very low pure time preference referring to extinction, whereas Nordhaus used a much higher time preference referring to people's ordinary myopia as shown by market interest rates. They use similar growth rate assumptions, so that's an empirical assumption about growth rates in the future, so there is not much reason for disagreement here. But then the priority parameter, the one which is about caring for the poor rather than the rich, is different there as well. And you see that Stern has taken a low value and obtained, at the end of the day, if you make the computation with the Ramsey formula, you obtain a discount rate of 1.4%, so close to the lower rate I used in my illustration, whereas Nordhaus used higher values, leading to higher discount rates. And there you see a first version of the green liberal dilemma. If you want to care a lot about the poor, well, as far as long-term environmental protection is concerned, the poor, that's the present generation, it's not the future generation, right? And so, so there is a tension here between caring about the environment and caring about the poor or the worse off. Now, there are two ways out of this dilemma for the green liberal. So you can refer to intragenerational inequalities, or you can refer to catastrophes. So let me go through that briefly. So intragenerational inequalities, the usual approach is to neglect these inequalities in climate policy because they are supposed to be taken care of by another department, the Department of Redistribution or something like that. But this bracketing aside of inequalities is forgetting the fact that climate change and climate policy, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, will have distributional impacts. And given the fact that the other department taking care of redistribution is unlikely to do its job in a perfectly coordinated and optimal way, then probably we should take account of these impacts as well. And we know that climate change is likely to increase poverty, and climate pricing is likely to be regressive in developed countries, and it might be progressive in developing countries, but nevertheless increasing poverty. And so we should be worried about these things. So what we've done with my colleagues was to take Nordhaus' Rice model and construct a NICE model. So NICE is NI is for nested inequalities, because we introduced inequalities within the regions of Nordhaus' Rice model. So Nordhaus' Rice model has 12 regions in the world, and we've introduced inequalities within each of these regions. And so what happens then is that climate change impacts, we can now represent how they impact the different quintiles within the regions. And what we found, and what is illustrated in this graph here, you have, so on the left-hand side, you have the carbon price, and here you have the emissions. Let's focus on the carbon price. The green curve here is what you obtain with the Nordhaus recommendations, or rather lenient policy. The purple one is the Stern recommendation, much higher carbon price. And so what we did was to keep Nordhaus parameters, okay? So accept his choice of parameters, but introduce inequalities within regions and introduce the possibility that climate change will increase inequalities through impacts which will affect the poor more severely than the rich. And so by doing that, by varying parameters on this assumption of the distribution of climate impacts, we can actually reproduce the Stern conclusions, right? So somehow intragenerational inequalities can lead to being very cautious about climate impacts because of their impact on the distribution. This is another illustration in another paper we published in Climatic Change, where we looked at what happened when we take into account not just the distribution of impacts of climate damages, but also the distribution of mitigation costs across the quintiles. And what turns out to be the case is that if you care about the worse off, it's really the difference between the distribution, the difference between the parameter representing how mitigation costs depend on income and the parameter that describes how climate change impacts depend on income. It's a difference between these two parameters, meaning that if you have mitigation costs which are borne mostly by the rich and protect the future poor from climate impacts, then if you care a lot about the poor, you'll be very ambitious about climate policy. But if it's the opposite, if mitigation costs are borne by the poor and will mostly protect the rich in the future, then the more you care about the poor, the less you'll be interested in climate policy. So I won't go through the detail of these graphs, but they just illustrate this, this phenomenon. Okay, the other way in which you can try to find a way out of the dilemma is to look at catastrophes. And there is a famous so-called dismal theorem by Martin Weizmann, and a very simplified and somewhat revised version of it would say the following: if you have a small probability of extreme poverty in the future, that may swamp your cost-benefit analysis of climate mitigation, meaning that it may justify putting an unbounded amount of resource into climate preservation. And why is that? Well, it may occur because if there is a risk of extreme poverty in the future due to catastrophes, such extreme poverty may have unbounded priority. And in technical terms, in economics, we would say the marginal utility may go to infinity. And so if that's the case, then the greater your priority for the worse off, the more you should worry about such possible catastrophes, even if the probability are not big. I'd like to add a caveat to this kind of reasoning, because Martin Weizmann was looking at catastrophes, again, a bit like Nordhaus, ignoring the inequality within generations, right? So catastrophes were only about the future. But in fact, if you introduce, again, intragenerational inequalities, catastrophes occur all the time. You still have extreme poverty in the world today, even if it's lower than it used to be. And so viewed from that lens, it's not clear that future catastrophes have more importance than the currently ongoing catastrophes affecting the poor people on this planet, right? So, that's just a remark I wanted to add here. Okay, now let me go to the second topic, which is about the issue of carbon pricing. So here you have two sides of the debate. You have people who have argued for a single price as possible, and including over the world, and that includes famous people, including a Nobel Prize. And you have three arguments for having a single price. First, it would minimize the total abatement cost. So that would equalize the marginal cost across all agents and regions, and that would minimize the total abatement cost. It avoids leakages. It avoids the temptation for polluting industries to transfer their activities to places where the price is lower. Okay, there is an interesting argument that if you link markets, suppose you have cap and trade in different regions of the world, if you link markets, this offers new opportunities for trade and therefore new opportunities for improvement of their situations for all participants. So in some cases, actually everybody can benefit from opening such a market. So linking markets can be really clearly an improvement. On the other side of the debate, you have Cicilniski and Hill, who have a couple of papers discussing the fact that when the distribution of resources is suboptimal, the carbon price should be differentiated, personalized across the different parties, and inversely proportional to the marginal social value of money of the people or countries that you are looking at. Okay, so let me call that the Cicilniski-Hill rule. So the marginal social value of money, what is that? This is essentially a measure of your priority for transferring resources to any given person or country. Okay. And so we could ask, is it really a big deal, this debate about whether we should have a unique carbon price or not? So my colleagues, Marc Fleurbaey and Francis Dennig, have looked at that using the rice regions. And on the left-hand side here, you have the different carbon prices that we should have if we allowed different prices for different regions of the world. So you'd have very high prices for the rich regions and very low prices for the poor regions. So very substantial differentiation of prices. On the other hand, if you want to look at the impact this differentiation has on the, for instance, the climate change scenario, so you have to compare these two curves here to look at something that refers to this graph. And these two curves are not so different, right? So when you have the original prices on the left, you obtain this thick curve here, slightly lower temperature than if you used a unique carbon price over the world, but it's not really a big deal. Now, the key question, of course, is not so much the impact on temperature, does it make a big difference on social welfare? Is it a big improvement? Well, here again, so this is the relevant bar to look at, given the parameters that we were considering in the previous slide. So the light gray area is the gain that you get. So the big black one here is just the fact that you do something rather than nothing. And so what's relevant to compare is the size of these two little bars here. And indeed, it is quite substantial. It is something that is a good improvement, but it's not necessarily such a big deal in terms of the overall picture. Nevertheless, I'd like to focus on the question of who is right and wrong in this debate, right? And here, there are questions about the arguments in favor of unique price. So the first argument, remember, was it minimizes total abatement cost if you have only one price. This neglects the fact that the total cost is not the only thing that counts. Who pays that cost? Who pays what portion of the cost matters, right? And so just focusing on total abatement is, or total cost is somehow taking a dollar as a dollar, whoever pays it. So this neglects inequalities. The issue of leakages is a serious, and it's an empirical issue. And I think it should lead to a revision of the Cicilniski-Hill rule. I've not worked it out, and I'm not sure anyone has done it, but yeah, it can be done. So that's a serious issue. The question of linking markets offering an improvement for all people, that's interesting, because what happens when you link markets is that the people will start trading, but when people trade, they will trade permits against money. And so this will implement transfers of resources that might not occur otherwise. And so that's something that may be good, actually, also for social welfare, right? So that's the reason why these things are good. They actually help in somehow loosening the constraints we may have on transfers of resources. But if you ask the question about the unique price, right? Linking markets is one thing. Having the same price for everybody is another thing. So you can actually have linked markets where prices remain differentiated. If you can implement that, which may be practically difficult, but if you imagine that you could do it, the question is it optimal to have a unique price or to still have differential prices for different people? And the answer, so I've worked on that with Ulrike Kuenne, and we came up with a modified Cicillinski-Hill rule. So the prices should still be differentiated, but in a way that is not exactly the same formula as the Cicillinski-Hill rule, right? So, so that's something that has not been discussed much and is worth discussing. So linking markets is one thing, but that does not necessarily mean that we should have a unique price. In another paper with Ulrike Kuenne, we've asked the question of what happens when we take into account incentives for income generation, economic activities, and the presence of redistribution. So that applies, this is more relevant for what happens within a country than what happens across the world, because there's not really a redistributive policy across the world in the way we have with the welfare state within countries. But what we find is the following: when income taxation can be adjusted, there is no need for differential prices of the externality of carbon, for instance, and even in suboptimal allocations. And the reason is that any allocation that involves differential prices is Pareto dominated by another allocation which has a single price and possibly an adjusted income tax. So Pareto dominated means that this other allocation is better for everyone, right? So what's interesting about this result is that it does show that differential prices may be useless, but the conditions of this result are rather demanding. So you need to have full flexibility of the income tax, and you need to have special assumptions about the preferences of the people in this economy. So you need to have special separability and homogeneity assumptions. So these assumptions being unlikely to be observed in practice, that rather shows, actually, usually this kind of result is used to show why we may expect that the differential prices may be useful and the reasons why they may be useful. Okay, so to summarize a little bit on this issue, I think what this heads toward is the idea that differential prices cannot really be separated from the question of burden sharing. The Cicillinski-Hill rule uses burden sharing to perform redistribution that fails to be achieved by the so-called other department of redistribution, right? So that's what it does really. And but what their work has left undetermined is how to prioritize different people and countries, right? So I refer to the marginal social value. Where does that come from? And here, and so we should really cast this question of carbon pricing and burden sharing together and discuss the reasons for giving different marginal social values to different parties, countries, people. And here you have either a pure distributive approach, so you can use a social welfare approach where you just give priority to the worse off, but you can also do something else, which is to refer to specific fairness principles. For instance, historical responsibilities is something that may matter. And it's actually possible to try to link this question to the economic theory of fairness, which exists and has not really been applied to this setting. So in a paper preparing with Ulrike Kuenne and Mourad Enofer, we are trying to come up with links between these approaches. This link has already been done for the adaptation policies by two colleagues and friends, Viette de Villeneuve and Leroux, but not so much, I think, for mitigation. I can't say much more about these principles. We are not yet at the stage where we can present that to a non-economic audience, but stay tuned. Hopefully we'll come up with something. Okay, I'd like to finish this talk by something which is even more recent than what I've said so far. It's really work in progress with the economist Ravi Kombur, and it's about the way externalities are discussed. And here I'll take as my straw man, my good friend John Broome, who has written about what he calls the most important thing about climate change. And let me read the slide in case it's not too good on your screen. Let me read what he says. So I'm quoting him now. Because climate change is an externality, there is a Pareto superior state we could move to. At Copenhagen, many nations came together and failed to reach an agreement. They were asked to make sacrifices, and they declined to do so, but no sacrifice is necessary. The nations might have been more amenable if they had understood that point. Okay, so here the key framing that John Broome is using is the fact that externalities are primarily an inefficiency problem, right? And this idea that they are mostly an inefficiency problem underlies the view that the climate department in charge of climate mitigation, for instance, can leave distributive issues to the other department, the one that cares about redistribution, as this has been practiced a lot by most climate economists. And yet, as we've seen with the discounting debate, in fact, they cannot totally avoid distributive issues, right? And especially between generations, the discounting debate is really about redistributive issues between them. But nevertheless, they try to avoid as much as possible the question, to separate, to bracket out the question of redistribution. And there is this framing that externalities are primarily an inefficiency problem. So I'd like to try to convey the idea that, in fact, this is not quite the case. Externalities are not primarily an inefficiency problem. They are, in general, an efficiency problem, but not always, and not only an inefficiency problem. So what is an externality? It's an influence that is not mediated by a transaction, right? That's the definition. An influence that's not mediated by a transaction. So when you take your car and you emit CO2, there is nobody who is, if there is no cap and trade or anything like that, there is no transaction that makes you buy the right to send that CO2 into the atmosphere. And so that's an externality. Now, because there is a lack of transaction, the general idea is that, well, if we could introduce transactions, that would make it possible to improve things for both parties and to move, as Broome was saying, to a Pareto superior state. And how do you do that? Well, you have to, these transactions would enable the victim to compensate the polluter for reducing pollution, and then everybody can gain, right? So somehow the victim has to bribe the polluter to accept to reduce pollution. Okay, but there is a but here, right? So there are issues here. So this is the usual framing. The problem is, I mean, there are several problems, and let me go through them. First, there are cases when compensation by the victim is impossible. And one such case is relevant to us here. The future generations, they cannot compensate the present generations, right? They have no way to influence the present generations. And so the pollution that's done by the present generations is primarily distributional issues. It is harming the future, right? And there is no way we can put a trade between the a transaction between the present and the future. So a Pareto improvement is possible in the case of the climate problem, only between the members of the present generations if they care about the future, and because then they treat the future well-being, the well-being of future generations as a sort of public good, and because they care of that, they may want their fellow citizens at the same time in present generations to reduce their pollution to contribute to that public good. But this public good is not the climate itself, it's just a sort of subjective good. It's the care that the present generation has for the future, and it's completely dependent on the present generation's altruism. So let me illustrate this with a simple example. So suppose you have two generations, and you have two categories of people who are dynasties in this world, right? So you have dynasty one, which may care, and to make things simple, I will assume that it cares only about its own descendants, right? It might care about all the future people, that's okay. It doesn't change my reasoning, but let me take a stark assumption, make a simple assumption. They care only about their descendants. And same thing for dynasty two, okay? So what will create an externality between the people from the first generation is the fact that the pollution emitted by dynasty two is harming the well-being of generation two in dynasty one, and likewise for the descendants of dynasty two, right? So it's the pollution that goes across dynasties in the future that, that is creating an externality between them. But you see, if they didn't care about the future, if the first generation was totally selfish, it could arrange things optimally between itself, and there is nothing, so it could decide optimally what kind of pollution, but there is nothing that the second generation can do to convince them to do less of pollution, right? So if they have no concern at all for the future, they would pollute happily, and there is nothing the second generation can do to prevent that. So the objection we could make, and people like John Bloom himself and other people have been looking at how we could imagine the future compensating us for our efforts. And we could do that, we could arrange that by reducing the human-made capital that we bequeath to the future, right? So somehow, could we make ourselves better off by reducing our investments in other fields and offering a better environment to the future? So that's one thing that could be imagined, but this objection doesn't work if we act fully rationally now. If we do the best for ourselves now, taking account of all things, influences among people of this generation, there is nothing the future can do to compensate us for any effort we would do on their behalf. Okay, the second point I want to make is that alleviating an externality cannot be done just by focusing on efficiency. You have to decide on the distribution, right? And so, for instance, if you look at the polluter pays principle, this is not an efficiency principle. It's actually something that prevents a Pareto improvement because it will make the polluter worse off than at the unregulated equilibrium. So you may have heard about the cause theorem that says that opening a market for pollution rights solves the externality, and it solves the externality no matter what the distribution of rights is. But of course, you have to decide what the distribution of rights is, otherwise you don't know what you will obtain. And as it turns out, only a few distribution of rights induce a Pareto improvement, right? So if you do something like the polluter pays principle, and you give all the rights to the victim, then this is not leading to a Pareto improvement. So there is a key distributional issue to consider anyway when we talk about finding a solution. The other thing is, third point is that focusing on Pareto improvements, as John Bloom was doing when talking about the Copenhagen meeting, may be counterproductive. And we have one of our visitors, Antonin Potier, who has published a book, unfortunately in French, I think, until now, which is about this idea that this discourse about Pareto improvements may be politically counterproductive. So imagine the world history in which a group of countries takes slaves, invades, colonizes another group of countries, and then it develops and it pollutes the atmosphere. So after that kind of history, you can still imagine a Pareto improvement in which the rest of the world that is not yet developed would slow down its development to avoid the worst climate impacts, and there could be some transfers and everybody could be better off. But of course, many developing countries, they see the climate problem through that lens. So for them, insisting on a Pareto improvement is likely adding insult to injury, right? And so that may be politically problematic. And finally, the last point I want to make in this respect is something that is about private initiative. So if we have socially responsible behavior by people, like firms, for instance, trying to take care of their emissions and do their best, how can that work, right? So what happens is that, yes, so socially responsible behavior by sufficiently many private agents can contribute to restoring efficiency of the allocation, but it will do that only if they not only agree that there is an efficiency problem, but they also agree on the distribution and the distributive goals that underlie the computation of their effort, right? So somehow they have to agree on a carbon price, and the computation of the carbon price depends on ethical values about the distribution, especially between generations, but also within generations. And so it is the case, nevertheless, that if you start from the unregulated equilibrium, if the people and the firms, they start to make efforts, that is great. That is really, and it's likely to lead to a Pareto improvement. Why that? Because at the unregulated equilibrium, the cost of mitigation is essentially negligible, but the impact of mitigation is not negligible. And so, so a very minor cost for people and a benefit for everyone, that leads to a Pareto improvement. But when we go far from the unregulated equilibrium, when people ramp up their socially responsible efforts, then in order to continue producing a social improvement and going toward the efficiency frontier of the economy, that can only occur if they coordinate more and more on a narrower and narrower range of distributional values. And that is something, so efficiency requires an agreement about equity. That's the point, if you rely on private initiative. Okay, and so I've reached the conclusion of this talk. So let me briefly review the main takeaway messages. So the first one was that intragenerational inequalities cannot be neglected given what the other department, the one that takes care of the distribution, does or especially doesn't do, especially at the world level. The second point is that carbon pricing is linked to and is really part of the burden sharing problem. They cannot really be separated. And so we need to combine allowances and differentiated markets and prices in order to obtain something that's politically and socially optimal. And finally, that externalities are as much a problem of distribution as of inefficiency, especially for the future generations who are totally helpless against what we do to them, right? Even if they are better off, right? And finally, I'd like to mention one point, which I haven't mentioned at all so far, relating to the green liberal dilemma. So typically, the people who care about the worst off also care about the dignity of other species and the intrinsic value of nature and other species. And so that's an important way out of the dilemma, right? So if you believe that there is intrinsic value to protecting other species, and many of them are very, very badly off, and perhaps worse off than most humans, then it's a great argument for doing something about the environment. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll now stop my screen sharing and give the floor back to Michael.
Thank you, Marc, for an incredibly engaging and wide-ranging talk. Now we're going to have questions. We're going to use the chat function. Marc is going to manage his own questions. So at this point, I see we already have people asking. So I invite the rest of you to type your questions, and Marc will read them in order.
Okay, so what I'll do is to read what I see in the chat, okay, and try to reply. So first, a question by Kuenne. And so the paper's use of the term liberal preference to avoid harms to the worse off is somewhat specialized, narrow. How do you think it relates to current public debates or to usual usage? Yeah, So I don't really, I'm not wedded to this term. The point here was more about this potential tension between caring about the worse off and caring about the environment. When the environment is attached to the future, because the future is better off than the present, then we have a tension. So it's only that, right? So there is no word liberal in any of the papers I mentioned. But if you have a better word, please suggest one. That is, yeah, this was just for making this a lively talk. You said there is a way that Broom suggests we make intergenerational transfers. We change the stocks of physical and infrastructural goods that we provide for the future. Yes, so I did mention that. Was your response that this is not a problem if we were to act rationally, but we don't invest anything close to rationally in this country? We let long-term infrastructure be dangerously degraded. Can you expand on your response to Broom? Yes, indeed. So that's a key issue, right? So if we behave, so either we behave fully rationally, and we handle things in the best way. So if we are totally selfish, so we might still leave infrastructures, especially knowledge infrastructure, right, science, to the next generations, because it's essentially costless to transmit that to them. If we are fully rational, even if we're selfish or if we are not selfish, there is nothing the future can do to make us change our course, right? So we are totally in charge of what we do. And that's a key problem. Now, if we are not totally rational, and you're right, and John Broome is right as well, if we are not totally rational, we can improve things, but we can improve things, and that has nothing to do with transferring or making transfer from the future to the present, right? So we can improve things for ourselves, and it has nothing to do with that. So so this issue of we can move to a Pareto superior thing then doesn't depend to any transaction with the future. There is no transaction. In any case, there is never any transaction with the future. That's what the point I'm trying to make. So Michael is the next one, I think, yeah. So Michael, you said, could you amplify a bit on the P factor? How did Nordhaus make the particular choice of range he made? So you are talking about the pure time preference term. Is that it, Michael, right? I guess so, right? So the pure time preference. So what Nordhaus said is that the market interest rates tell us something about people's preferences for transfers between now and the future, transfers of resources. And somehow he said that Stern was a bit technocratic in deciding on the basis of ethical arguments, and that we should be more democratic and respect what the markets are telling us about people's preferences. And so the P factor, the pure time preference, came from whatever needed to be put in the computation to get a value that was close to the market interest rate. Because the other terms, you had the growth rate term, which is an empirical term, and you had the priority term. So that it took from some estimates, empirical estimates of how people care about their the smoothness of their consumption over their life, which is not clearly relevant to that question here because we are talking about different generations. We are not talking about people's smoothness of consumption over their own lifetime. But that was empirical as well. And so the P factor, the pure time preference, was just what remained in the formula to make up the discount rate that was similar to the market interest rates. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. Okay. And then Bob Cohen. Hello, Bob. Good to read you here. And so political inequalities correlate worldwide with economic inequalities. The poor are weaker than the rich. Yeah. From a political science perspective, therefore, it seems unlikely that self-interested people in powerful states will pursue redistribution. Do you have any ideas about how to increase the political influence of disadvantaged people? Wow. Yeah. I hope you are better equipped than me to talk about that, right? So the point, nevertheless, is that it's not totally clear that the correlation is completely in this direction, because what we observe, for instance, in many developed countries, is that the people who care the most about redistribution are not necessarily the people at the bottom of the distribution. You have among the middle class a lot of people who care about the distribution and are willing even to make sacrifices in order to improve the distribution. And so yeah, so the enlightened part of the population can realize that it may be in the long-term interest of everybody to reduce inequalities, and maybe crises like what we are living now make people realize that vulnerability and lack of resilience among poor populations creates dangers for everyone and creates serious disruptions so for society at large. So that might be yeah, things that would push in that direction. But the question of political influence for disadvantaged people is an important one, and there are many recipes, practical recipes for that. But that's a totally different topic, right? But there are so many experiments of participation in various parts of the world, including in developing and emerging economies, which are on some fronts perhaps even more advanced than developed countries. That this is worth taking inspiration from. Yeah. And so, yeah, Rob Sokolo asks, can't my grandchildren pay me to stop flying? Generations overlap. Yes, that's true. So in my simple example, I was looking at generations that don't overlap. And so we can have things that happen when generations overlap and certain forms of reciprocity that go across generations, one after the other, thanks to this overlapping phenomenon. So that's one interesting thing. It still leaves it clear that for generations that don't overlap, there is no way the future generation can make something that will help or bribe or compensate any effort that the early generation makes, right? So this still remains. So when we talk about a change, reciprocity across generations, as we do in some pay-as-you-go pension systems, for instance, we are really hoping that people will stick to the system, right? So if at some point people decide they stop participating, that's it. And there's nothing the future generations can do to prevent that. I think I don't see any new question in the chat. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's correct.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any more in the chat box. If any of the participants do have further questions, we'll give it just another moment for you to use the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
We did also set it so that you can unmute yourself. So if there is a question that we can take live, we can also do that as well.
Thanks, Gil.
Mark, this is Michael. Let me ask you, actually what I was referring to was the second item, not the pure rate of time preference, but the multiplication factor.
Oh, priority.
Which has to do with priority, yeah. And that seems to me to be a very powerful cause of the difference between Stern and Nordhaus. Where did Nordhaus get that factor from? You sort of tailed off at the end here and I wasn't clear.
Yeah, right. So as I was saying, they took that from the estimate of the preference that people have for smoothing their consumption over their lifetime. Another source of possible estimation is people's risk aversion, right? Because all that has to do with the the curvature you put in the utility function that you use, and this utility function is applied to the consumption of the people. And so why would you use a curved utility function? So either you say, well, this is the utility function of the people themselves, and this curvature may represent either their risk aversion or their what is called the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, which is about how worried are they to go through phases, spells of poverty in their lifetime, right? So if people really never want to have big fluctuations in their income, they really are worried about this. And so, so these are different ways in which we can try to empirically estimate a curvature of a utility function. But that assumes that this utility function is something that is a feature of the people, whereas the Stern approach is a little more taking the view that this has a lot to do with the social evaluation, right? The policymaker deciding how much priority we put on the worst of people in society. And in that case, this is something that is more an ethical parameter than an empirical parameter. But yeah, so sorry, I misunderstood your P parameter, but that was, yeah, so Nordhaus wanted to take that as much as possible from empirical data. And Stern was willing to put a bit more ethical principles there. And I think Stern has a point, right? So when we talk about transfers across many generations, especially if we look at a horizon of 3, 4, 5 centuries, it's hard to imagine that the risk aversion of individuals now or their concern about fluctuations within their own lifetime is something that's relevant to the trade-off between me and my great-great-great-great-grandchildren. So this is, I think, a strong point for the ethical approach to the choice of this parameter.
Isn't your latter point also relevant to the pure rate of time preference? Who knows what it would be? You know, you're doing sort of an experiment in sample, but we're going to be way out of sample in dealing with people's preferences in the future. Is there evidence that either of these terms has been stable over the last 100 years, for instance? That would be interesting.
Right. So uncertainty about the future is something that can justify being less sure about what we do to the future, right? It's not a particularly, I mean, but this has no direct relation to the choice of these parameters, right? So it's more an empirical question. How much uncertainty is there about the consequences of our actions for the far future? And that includes uncertainty about the future preferences of future generations, right? And so they might, even if we give them a degraded environment, they might care less of the environment once they are adapted to that. And this sort of question. So, so uncertainty about our impacts is something that will be in the description of the impacts, but not in the criterion of evaluation itself, right? So that will lead to something that looks like discounting the future, because there is no way to tell whether what you do has good or bad consequences. It washes out, and so you may be unsure. So it's as if you were not caring about the consequences, but in fact, in reality, you do care about the consequences. You just don't know what they are. So it's important to make a difference between these two considerations. So I think there were a few queries here. Let me read them. So one was, what about time with respect to generations? For some generation, there is little future left. For others, hopefully, many years of the future. How does that factor in to altruism? I think that's connected to Rob Sokolo's point. So when I was talking about generations, I was talking about people living their whole life at a particular time in history. I was not talking about people at different ages, different age groups living at the same time. So it's true that at any given moment, you have people who are close to the end of life and others who just start their life. And that triggers potential possibilities of worries and also of arrangements that they can make, right? And indeed, and this can help because you can have chains of altruism. So if people care more about their children and a little bit about their grandchildren, but not so much about the great-grandchildren, that might be actually not too bad, because that will be true of their children. Their children will care about their great-grandchildren for them. And so, so this chained altruism may have an impact which is similar to general altruism, where everybody would care about all the future. But if there is but nevertheless, that may introduce a sort of pure time preference. There may be a declining concern for the future, which probably has little ethical value, right? So sometimes people justify the pure time preference for this idea that people care more about their children than their grandchildren and so on. But that it's not clear that this is something that should be taken into account in a purely ethical evaluation of the climate problem. The second query was about uncertainty, climate catastrophe as opposed to economic catastrophe. What about complex ecosystems that are fragile rather than stable, and when disrupted can have random and anticipated consequences and cost, especially with regard to thinking about the discount rate? Yeah, so when I was talking about catastrophes, I was thinking of catastrophes for future well-being. And so it could be that we only care about human beings, and then a catastrophe would be an ecosystem that falls apart and harms the future human beings. If we do care about more species than the human species, that's also that can be put into the analysis, right? And a catastrophe might be a catastrophe for some species, including or not including the human species. So again, as I was telling Michael, this has more to do with the consequences of what happens, and indeed, a big catastrophe is something very important, even if it has a small probability, and that's the essence of Weitzman's theorem, dismal theorem. Perhaps, do we have time to take one more question? I see a question by Bob Cohen.
Yes, definitely. Take the last question.
Okay. So it's not clear to me how differentiated pricing by region would work. Wouldn't one always have leakages as a result of arbitrage? In a global economy, the profit opportunities for hedge fund managers would seem to be enormous. Yes, I agree with that. And that's why I was cautious about that and saying it's not totally clear how it would work. So I agree. This is something, and the leakage problem is also happening when markets are not connected, right? And so that's a serious empirical issue, and I don't have any particular evidence or knowledge about the empirical facts around this. But what I found interesting is that if we could avoid leakages, right, this argument that opening markets, which normally automatically equalizes the prices, is something that is good. Actually, it's not the end of the thing, right? So we can still do better than that by keeping differential prices. And that's the thing that is a bit surprising. And I've never seen this argument made anywhere. And so that shows that somehow opening markets is still leaving some distributional issues on the table, and that we could take care of. Perhaps differential prices will not work in practice and we still need to do something else. But at least it shows that it's not a killing argument for opening markets and having a single price over the world.
Great, thank you so much, Marc, for your presentation today, and thank you all who were able to join us for the final C-PREE Bradford seminar of the semester. We hope that we'll be back on campus again in the fall, and we'll be doing a new series with all our new speakers in the fall. So thank you again for joining us, and Marc, thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for the discussion and questions. Thank you.